wrote something last night that I wanted to talk about, and this is a concept based upon a kind of paradox of consciousness and format for this realm and the way things are experienced. There's actually a larger portion to this, but I want to make this a short one because it kind of will just turn into riddles, basically, which can go on forever, and they're real interesting. It's like the Zen koans, I think it's koans. If you experience this or come to these conclusions, you'll recognize it as you hear it. And as well, with the terms that are used, the words, it's so weird. I don't have my front-facing camera, so it's like I don't have a focal point. And so the words have been used throughout the entirety of civilization, and they're kind of corrupted because they're connected to certain parts of society, and these parts are very, very controlled and manipulated. However, you'll see that this information being continually even reappropriated, if not misappropriated, throughout all of time, even any other culture or society, means that it's the basis for consciousness, possibly society or civilization itself. Which means it's something very, very deep, and it's almost like you can't escape it. Not in a bad way, it's just the meaning touches everything. Before I ramble on. So this is basically about the interplay between spirit and the thinking mind, the acting mind, the one who talks and does, and the paradox, which is constructed out of the paradigm of the interplay between the two. And that's really all you need to say, but I'm going to go and try and explain it. But the basic idea, and I put a post on this, is that you have the spirit, and I'll give a quick definition. The spirit is basically the most subtle or refined energies that you contain, meaning that if there was a measurement to detect your voice or your brainwaves or heat coming off your body or the motion through space and air, the sensory system to detect that motion, the technology, or even your body, is lower and less refined, less clarified than the ability to sense energy at the level of the more refined spirit or subtle energy, meaning it's a thinner or higher frequency or wavelength. Kind of look at it, so you have a screen, and the information of, say, your body, your brain waves, the thoughts, they'll get caught on the screen. If you have that same screen, you have the spiritual information, the essence, your spirit can permeate through that, and you can't contain it. It's kind of like a liquid or a gas. And so it kind of complicates things, but that's the basic idea. From there, the basic idea, I guess, of the beginning of the explanation is that we have two versions of ourselves, and there's technically more. However, the first breakdown and even the end is two. There's everything in two, and it relates to duality. But essentially, first, above, and always, there is spirit. Kind of like looking at the camera alone. Not really, though. Just look at the camera staring at me anyway. There is spirit, and that's beyond having to use words. The tendency or the nature of using words and even thinking is constructed, shaped, formed, and relative to closer to this physical, mundane, material reality, and therefore the body, while the spirit is the highest element, not removed, but before all of that. But this relates to the concept that before you speak, you think, and before you think, there are feelings or intentions. And so those intentions, in the same way that they're before a word has formed in your mind, before you've mulled over an idea and decided on something to do and took action, or said something before the action. The feeling is related in the same sense to subtle energy, which is not yet defined as an expression or translation in this physical reality. And so the idea is that the spirit is the aspect of you that is before anything appears in the physical reality as something relative to your body. It is the all, if you can call it that. It is the before, and as well as what people call the I a lot, because in that state of spirit, there doesn't have to be words and symbols or ways to describe things. It is 100% pure knowing, meaning you don't have to describe anything, it's already there. And in that sense, when the I, or your you can kind of call your consciousness, but that's more related to your brain as consciousness, as a kind of biological process, that is still you. And in that sense, it's actually when you'll decide on your own, but some will say that it's more you than the words you use. That when you're just in this type of serene, all-knowing state, before you try to produce the words, or you do produce whatever words you're using, that in essence the words work to translate, but they don't do justice. And the truest version of you is one without words, the one that only you can know and perceive within, and it's also, again, beyond perception, so it's beyond what you perceive. It's not a biological, sensory translation of information from one format to another. It's beyond all of that. It's pure awareness, pure intention. Because if somebody tells you something, you have a reaction, okay, there's a feeling, you didn't form words yet. Then you go and translate that. That feeling before words, that's spirit. So the idea I want to kind of portray or present here is that the mainly what we do in the body, what we do as beings who translate the spiritual awareness into words, ideas, rhythms, basically patterns of behavior and cycles of activities that we more or less repeat, and we create these patterns. Those do not define who we are as well as simply going within, and people make fun of it in a way, but and doing nothing. And the paradox is that by doing nothing, if you and who you are becomes oriented and awakened to this I, this larger I within you, and you know now who you are, and you don't feel like you're basically running around like a goose chase of trying to figure out how you have to present yourself or what identity you really have, if the act of doing nothing in that sense, or withdrawing from the physical, the ego, the mundane, gives you the greatest, most heightened sense of knowing yourself, then that act of doing nothing is actually the act of doing everything. It's the most self-reflective and efficient act that results in the most gain, or the most benefit, which is paradoxical and backwards to what we think. And so there's the basis of the paradox, which is that we think, we identify, and through the thinking, we identify with the thoughts. But it's all a word play. We're the one observing the thoughts. The thoughts are not us. We're creating them. So they're like a canvas, and you paint the thoughts on the canvas, and what if you painted, and then you said, this is me, and you put it on as a mask, and you walked around, and somebody talked to you, and you spewed paint at them? It wouldn't make any sense. And that's also what we do out here. We try and fit into a grid that's designed to match the requirements of physical beings or identities that are wholly, primarily, defined by the activity of the brain. And it's very simple. It's just the brain waves. It's just the emotions, the more not complicated, but more, in a way, convoluted. There's more filler there, and there's room for translation error or distortion, and there's a kind of variety of ways to distort it, and we get accents, or the way somebody is confused in life and they go through life. if everything was pure spirit, there would never be any confusion, and we'd all more or less be very, very similar in the sense of how we communicate or view one another, because we wouldn't need language. We would just feel next to each other, and the other person would feel that instantly, and that would be it. And some of the tribes still interact this way, and so it doesn't mean you have to turn into a big ball of light to get like that. And as well, they're kind of like one big family. And so, but therein lies the beginning of the paradox, that we use the mind to view ourselves in reality. But if we're using the mind, then what happens when we view the mind and we're viewing ourselves? It's like a camera. You use the camera to view reality and look at the tape. Okay, well, can you take the camera and have it look at itself? And have it perceive itself? That should not be possible if the camera is all the view that one has access to. But if you can view yourself in some miraculous way, then it proves that you're more than the camera, but you're using the camera to perceive and interact in this environment. And so basically, the camera is like our ego, it's like our body, and we use that to experience reality, and it's not who we truly are, because it's more or less something we identify with to give ourselves a perspective or a standpoint and organize how we are to interact and relate to the environment and to others. Again, we could do it with just spirit, and a lot of people do, but at that point we wouldn't have the problems, wars, things like that, but we would have a great sense of learning with one another, but we also wouldn't have, in those little distortions and differences, the things that kind of help us learn and grow and make things interesting. It would just be pure spirit, there would be no mistakes, and there would be, it's a toss-up whether it be more or less learning. So it's kind of depending on it. So the second thing I wanted to say, and that can go on for years, I mean, we still haven't figured it out. The mind-body duality, how does it work? Are we this? Are we a body with a mind, or are we a mind viewing the body? Which is which? It's both in neither, or it's both at the same time, one and the other at the same time. It's never neither, because that doesn't make sense. And so here's the second part, that the spirit knows because it operates in those subtle energies, and the energies, the format is so subtle and refined that there is no lag between intention or pure feeling or awareness and another awareness. It just happens. Now, the thoughts we think are routed, literally like it's backloaded through a driver running through software on an external device and going back into the computer. So now the computer's using this device to think, but it really has its own thinking system, and it doesn't have to put the information out here and then figure it out like it's kind of filtering through your phone that's connected to it, and you're using the phone on the calculator to draw it up on the computer and use that when the computer has its own. Which is weird to connecting compared to a computer, but that's kind of how it works. If you haven't noticed, it's there's a lot of similarities. And so the idea is that the pure spirit has no lag, but everything related to the mundane, the physical, the brainwave activity, the computational patterning of brainwaves and neurochemical responses, which is kind of like a computer, the way it's mapped out. Every aspect of that takes a delay, even if it's a nanosecond. You could say, I spoke with Jasmine, and this is something that I talked about, where you, in the pre-show, you have an impulse, or is it called a stimulus, and the nerve impulse or firing response goes through the specific types of nerve. They go to a specific like nerve highway and link up. Eventually they make it to a major nerve that leads to the spine, and then that goes to the brain. Then it's interpreted in the hippocampus or one of hypothalamus, one of the other, like the H1s, and then from there that informs the brain where to orient that nerve impulse to, and then view that as a perceptual sensory input. And after that happens, you say, I felt something. There's tests where they poke them, and then you press the button, and there's a slight delay. And they've actually found that the brain creates not an illusion, but a simulation of what the response feels like after the response is felt. It feels it, and that's the raw data. Then, like a virtual system is running, it creates a response of what that felt, and that's you feeling it. It's not that you thinking about it, that's what we feel. The brain's response, thinking about the raw data going through. So we don't actually feel, which is weird. We don't actually feel reality, let alone we don't actually touch anything because of the whole atoms things and electrons, if you ever look into that. But the basic, and everything's 99% empty space, but the basic idea is that there is a delay, no matter how finite or small that delay is, there is still a delay. And as well, imagine if spirit moves infinitely fast. So a delay of a thousandth of a second, or nanosecond, or a millisecond, okay, or even less than that, even dare I say Planck time worth of delay, and 100 years or a second worth of delay. To something infinitely fast, there's no difference. It's both infinitely slow by comparison. And this kind of gets weird defining of what's the definition of infinite speed or fast, but just bear with that. You could say it's non-local, meaning it's from outside the universal boundaries of what would be utilized to measure such speeds, meaning you technically could not measure it, because your chart would go all over you'd have to encompass the entire universe in order to pull an accurate measurement. And you can only say, well, each measurement pattern we use, the boundaries, it goes off the charts, so we're just going to guess that it's eternal or infinite. And so the idea is that since there's that delay, it's as if the camera that we're using has a, not a fader, but like I know a beat delay in music, but I guess you could say it's a delay, like the trails or whatever. And as well as kind of like the stars, how the stars are so far away, if you believe in that, and as well, if not, then they just interact in a certain way. That the idea, and it's basically just a super dense fluid that would take that much energy to get into that field, as much as the same amount of energy of getting 100 million light years away. And it could be 10,000 miles that way, but there's such an electromagnetic shielding, a barrier between the two, that you'd have to literally use the amount of energy that would be required to go 100 million miles away. And kind of an interplay of meaning here, where it brings one to the same results. And there's kind of barrier between the two, the inner and the outer. The idea is they're so far away, by the time the light hits us and gets here, we're seeing the past, and what we're seeing isn't actually there, and in effect, we can't actually see anything other than the past. And if you work out a little schematic there, you can figure out a way that you could interact with the past and the future of distant civilizations if you find a faster-than-light technology travel, or not travel, but an information transfer method. You can beam each other the information of what you're looking at from a distance, bending light, and then you could send each other the future and the past of each other's civilizations, but you can never directly see your own. You'd have to first link up with another civilization and then agree to do that, and things like that have gone on. Either that or it's just, a ploy, but stranger things have happened. And so the idea is that we have this delay, this type of fader type effect, like the camera is always at least 1 second in the past. So the idea is then, the spirit is, since it has no limit, it's instantaneous, the act of orienting our awareness from consciousness, like a holographic, delayed, computational process that requires time and is like the crashing of a wave or an algorithm kind of cascading down, and the equations are mapping themselves out and producing responses, but it takes us, every time you finish one, well, there's a new one being formed, and it's this continual rolling effect. So there's none of that with intention or pure awareness. It's instantaneous. The idea is we can shift from that computational consciousness system and accelerate that until we kind of flip into the awareness of the spirit. And this is part of the energy activation thing, which I really don't know how to describe or how that relates to whether the chakras are a trap or the third eye or what it is. But I do know that something does happen, and it maps out and it makes sense that it's basically breaking the consciousness light barrier that seemingly holds us back into our own localized temporal reference field, and that by overcoming that we move into a non-local reference field, like the inverted time, where the time code becomes inverted and flips inside out, like a parabola turning inside out. And so the idea is that we do that in a strange way, and it's ultimately through an act of pure observation. So then that's basically it. That's the whole talk. That's the show. And so from there, it gets a little confusing, because how do you do that? All it is that when we observe, when we do anything, and we're using the brain until this flip is switched, flip the switch. The switch is flipped. I know I was going to say it like that. Until we do that, we're in the past, basically. We're behind the moment. We're chasing the moment. Like the moment is actually now, and we're behind it, kind of trying to, and we're either closer to it or farther away. We're not at it, because if we're at it, we're there, and everything is happening instantaneously. Trying to imagine that once you get to here in the now moment, then for all of time, it's all happening now, because there is no 2 or 3 nows. There's only one now, and everything is happening. But there's multiple delays, because you can go anywhere in time depending on how delayed you are. And so the point is, our consciousness and our entire civilization is based upon living inside that delay, like we're in a temporal distortion bubble in our own minds. And but the idea is that whenever we do something, we think we're doing it and that we're in the presence of our true self. We're using the camera as if the camera's on a robot body, and that body is interacting, and we're viewing through it. We're viewing the camera, and in that sense, acting through the body. That's the delayed version, whereas the actual version is pure intention that occurs before the body or the camera activates and moves, and it's an agent, an observer agent, that decides or chooses to activate the body and the observational aspect in the first place. And your spirit is doing that, even though we're not taught to and we don't realize it at first, at least. So the idea is, if you can go into a state of pure observation where you're doing nothing, and this means literally not thinking in the sense that you're basically activating that camera system, that mind. Eventually, you get into a state, I think they call it clear mind or no mind. You get into that state and it feels kind of like liquid. That it doesn't feel, by comparison, it feels like the gears of a car or an old computer system or even a spring-loaded computer system. And it feels like that's the brain, but when you get into the other state, you're going direct to what you were looking for, what you were hinting at. Excuse me, throat's doing something. And so, the act of pure observation must be performed or undergone for an amount of time that is required to shed the temporal delay, the drag of time through your energy body that is embodied or accompanies or encompasses, bad reuse of words, when that computational calculation system is active. When that is most active, there is a delay. And so, say that delay sets us back 5 seconds from the actual now moment, the actual second. So that means we have to match 5 seconds of absolute stillness in mind, and we'll eventually have this emergence, like a flower blooming, into what is the now moment. And it's really a spiritual identity of pure awareness that is basically beyond ego. And there's more to talk about this. I didn't want to make this a long one because it's not fully written out. This might be a better post to write out fully, but I'm gonna try and organize some of the ideas that I wrote down. And I've been doing this since I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I still don't really know how to explain it. But I got a lot better, I guess you could say. It's like this, in one way to look at it. It's very riddle-based because that's how reality is. When you put it all together, there's one and the other. It's never just one thing, and the one and the other are kind of like opposites that come together to create a union, a divine marriage. And but the idea is that so the goal, whenever one is doing something, they are in body consciousness, in ego. Whenever one is purely observing, they are in spirit. The goal is to be in spirit while in the body and to do whatever is being done with pure awareness of the spirit. Thinking takes one out of the spirit, thus to do while in the spirit there can be no thinking, only knowing and a direct connection to the act of doing. And to know, one must observe and see. If we drop out of that observation and pure seeing, we begin to think and mull over ideas, and it's the brain chattering and calculating and coming up with thoughts, their thoughts basically. And so, if one is seeing, they cannot do or participate in an action without falling out of spirit unless the spirit and the mind have met and aligned to the same goal. That's one of the main kind of like tenets, I don't want to use that word, that they can be friends, but they must first align. The body consciousness must orient to your spiritual awareness, which is pure and is out of ego. Until then, when one tries to bring spirit into body consciousness or uplift body consciousness into spirit, which is a simultaneous occurrence, it won't work. The two will be at odds with each other, and it will result in a failed attempt, basically. When the goal of consciousness in the body seeks to align with the highest intentions of spirit, which seek nothing in relation to the mundane world, then this withdrawal of that delay system occurs, and one experiences basically a spiritual unveiling, and the self is transformed mentally into something else. It's not really like you turn into a transformer or you see God immediately, although if you do this every day, you will see what people describe as God, or I like to call the Most High, or the one true Creator. That all our thoughts, all our worries, these things, they take us out of that element, out of that passageway to the divine. And, heaven is within us in the mind. And as well, to get the mind to orient with spirit, the heart, a clear heart, is basically used to create a kind of catalyzation that is able to push the mind upwards, leaving the shadow behind, but it doesn't separate the shadow, it transforms it into light. And that energy is literally like a rocket going upwards. And it has to be done or activated, and as well, it's not an active doing of the ego or the conscious mind. So there's all these paradoxes. And as well, it happens a lot spontaneously, but it usually only happens a few times spontaneously or here and there, and it's not something that is guided in that sense. So the goal is to learn how to guide it and do it intentionally, do it on your own. But that's these paradoxes will continue because you do it intentionally, but you cannot intend to do it, because then you're activating that conscious ego, and it becomes a property of the brain, and the brain cannot conceive the divine. And so the goal of this, and here it goes again with it, the goal of the spirit is no goal. It doesn't have a goal. It simply is. There's no defining value of the spirit. It's here, there, having a goal, not having a goal, this goal, that. It's not no goal. It's no goal individually. It's that goal over there, sure, over here, whatever, that one, sure, that one too. It's all goals, all the goals, all the intentions in one that you harbor naturally as a living sentient being. Doesn't mean you want to become a potato or something like that. That's just not originally in the system. And so the idea, though, is that by having an individual sense of what to do and how to activate it and walk the pathway, it takes one out of the element of receiving it. And so it doesn't mean that you can't do it through doing that, but that it activates the brain. And in that sense, it's hard to describe. And so it has no goal individually, and in that sense, it's all goals. I had a better way of completing that thought, and so, excuse me, I'm reading off of there. And so there's only accomplishment and pure enjoyment in the spirit. The goal of the ego, here's more clarification on that. The goal of the ego is, or the mind, the body mind, if you will, the brain, is to find the problem and then provide a solution. To calculate an equation based upon differences, contrast, duality, and then pull information from that and produce knowledge, or information basically, not necessarily knowledge. When the information and the spirit are combined and the feeling of the heart, then you get wisdom. And what I forgot 2 seconds ago about the ego is that when the heart merges with the goal of the mind, and that becomes the goal of the mind, the pure heart, not just like desires and pleasures, but the actual heart, okay, which is kind of like the spirit in a different form, then the goals, they combine in a way that complements one another, and there's a synergy, and that synergy, it provides results, but the actual effect can't be described because it's equally described as saying there are all effects, all changes, all possibilities, all awarenesses happening simultaneously at once. You basically see yourself from all angles, and there's no longer an outline of how that is supposed to happen or what can be. It's simply something that is. And that's the other aspect of kind of what I forgot, and I kind of remember now, is that there's no shape to the spirit. There's no outline, there's no deviation, there's no one part of it or another. It's all one. The ego is only a segment, it's a continual segmenting of information that we use to define ourselves. It's just like a computer, it's the same process, just organic. And so when that basically merges with what is non-dual instead of a continually contrasting duality and interplay, it begins to change in format, and basically the knowledge we pull from spirit, it's not the same as learning through the brain and reading or something like that, because all the knowledge is already within us. And that doesn't really make sense. It's, you know, if we're viewing the camera, but we're not the camera, how is that possible, blah, blah, blah. None of it really makes sense, unless it's from a higher dimensional perspective. But the idea is there's a wealth of knowledge within us, and by moving out of that ego into that higher state, it is as if it's kind of like getting the answers to the problems without having to ask the questions, which is really weird in the first place. And so so the ego, the spirit sees enjoyment. The ego, and it has no goal. The ego can not exist unless there is a goal, unless there is something to do by someone within an environment, and everything is at an interplay, segmented, kind of like has to be a structure, okay, a thing, basically. And so the ego only sees problems, and the spirit only sees enjoyment. And so to do what one does in enjoyment is to see the spirit. To see only through the ego eventually brings only suffering. Traveling, and then here's where it gets kind of like weird, that traveling to the world of the ego is a passage along a treacherous journey where one may forget the nature of the spirit, which is the nature of the ego, to think and only see the shadow of the self, as if we're in that delay that's always behind who we truly are, which is the one that's seeing all of this, not the one experiencing it. It's the one observing. And just think about that, mull over that for a while. The observer-experiencer duality or interplay. Which one, when are you observing this? Like right now, and when in the moment between I had the thought and the impulse, before I said right now, I was observing. As soon as I began talking, I'm experiencing again. I'm in the world. Okay, so right there, that breath I took in, it was an eternity of observation. There was no beginning or end, it was just pure awareness. We're actually in that state all the time, and it's like a light bulb turning on and off, and we're popping into what we consider to be this world to interact with it, but half the time we're in some other existence. We're in apparently every other life, or, you know, maybe not reincarnated life, but every other realm, we're actually in them half the time. And it doesn't mean that like the other one or the other one, all of the other places that we will ever be, we're in right now, overlaid or underlaid in this experience. But again, the ego won't understand that, and it's not designed to. It's made to look and find a solution for a problem that it found. And in this environment, though, not in over there, not what you can't see, not underground, not in your own mind, but right here. Which is fine, but that's like somebody said that the ego, on one of the videos a while ago, somebody said the ego is basically a part of the part of the truck that backs up when you're beeping. Like, that's what the ego is. Like, it looks for threats to the environment, it makes sure you're not too hungry or tired or so on and so forth, and it handles that. We stay in that all the time, going, you know, are you a threat, or how can I handle this pleasure, or, you know, do you have food, or do I have to work for you? What is it? We're in that survival mode all the time. That's not actually who we are. It's the beast. It's the unconscious. When the heart combines, it enlightens, the sun rises within. You turn the unconscious into the conscious, and it becomes super conscious. And the ego becomes something different as well, and we become spiritually awakened. And you have to let go of fear and all these partialities and essences like that, because it's a whole host of reasons and what goes on when we're controlled by fear. Basically, fear is from the mundane realm. It's a part of the shadow mind. It's not the entirety of our existence. And so, in continuation, this is the end, or the beginning. It's the journeys from heaven to earth to hell, of being going through the passageways, of trying to return, of through the desert, so on and so forth. it's moving into ego. It's moving from the higher level into the brain and the body consciousness, and basically being in the belly of the beast, where our identity is marked by desires and fears and instincts, and it's literally like living as an animal, or living amongst the animals or the wolves or something like that. We become like the animals through that journey, but it's treacherous because every time that happens, there is a chance we could forget for a very long time, and we have to slowly build ourselves back together and rise to the top. One of the ways to see it is that if this is a civilization simulation, ancestor simulation, the idea is everybody in society gets around and meets in the town square. They say, today's the day we're going to activate the sim. They do it and everyone dies. And everyone wakes up in circa 1900 from, however many thousands of years or millions of years later, whatever you want to look at it as. The people that end up making it back to that civilization in the future that started it are those who slowly piece together the truths and the awareness, the pieces of the fact of what happened, and grow and spiritually evolve and develop until that civilization becomes the one that started it once again. And so it's like it's impossible to die. But the worry, or the risk, the adventure, is that it might take a very long time to gain ourselves back. That's us as spirit coming down into the body, waiting, looking to go back up into the mind of the spirit where there's no fear and there's only self. The ego sees the mind and only the shadow. The spirit sees only the self, no shadow. It's all one. It's all one organism. It's all one being. And so thus the journeys through the world of the ego to see the shadow and then come back to the spirit of the self, or thus one journeys through the world of the ego, excuse me. And so so here's where it gets weird. It's either an adventure of spirit or an illusion. And in a way you could say it's not an adventure to spirit because everything is an adventure to spirit. So there's no distinction there. But it is an illusion to consciousness to experience the self away from that spiritual existence, that non-dual, eternal aspect where there is literally a lack of definition in the sense of what we use to define ourselves as physical, limited, not knowing beings. Meaning that consciousness is basically defined as the shadow of the entirety of knowledge, or it's the introduction of ignorance, or the possibility to not know ourselves. And in that sense, each second, each moment, each aspect of this reality is as if we're not actually in the moment, we're in this continual replay of time, and the whole idea is to stop interacting, to make more time, and allow a well of observation to create a vacuum of space-time or consciousness, a temporal vacuum between where you are in the ego and where the true now moment is 5 seconds, 10 seconds, whatever it is from now, and use that vacuum of not going along with what's trying to have you basically make motions to fill in that empty space and drop the now second back to you, or rise up to the now moment, however many seconds away that is in relativity. And by doing that, you're accelerating your presence in time. You're accelerating your consciousness until you're coming closer to the moment, as if the moment is cascading like a waterfall directly in front of us. But the point is, the ego always takes time to do that. The brain, the consciousness, the spirit is pure intentions, and so it literally doesn't take any time. Yet, the now moment, everything is happening simultaneously. There is no delay of now. When is now? Well, it's already happened, because you can't describe it, you can't define it, because that takes time to do so, and by the time you finish taking whatever time it's going to take to do that, that time of the now goes on. Excuse all the puns. And so, but the idea is the spirit doesn't take time, so the act of doing that is not an act, it's a pure observation, an awakening, a fluttering of energy until it's basically an epiphany, an aha moment, and you basically rise or come into the moment, and there is a feeling of, it's indescribable. It's as if the reality, it's like a dream, when you're becoming lucid in a dream, same exact thing. And you do that in the now moment, you do that here and now. And it's the same thing with the dream. Look at the dream and compare and use them to understand what's going on. In the same way that in a dream, if you're not lucid, well then you go by the dream and you remember it, but you don't know. You don't know until you wake up. and then you have all those memories of the dream. Only when you're lucid are you actually in the dream. You see? So we're in this virtual overlay, but when we become lucid, when we come to the now moment, when we become wakeful of pure spirit, and then we are actually intending what happens next instead of just going along with the script, that's when we're putting ourselves into time, but in that sense, there's no time to describe where we are, or how long it takes to get there, or how long we're there, because it's all maxed out and it's indefinable. And in other words, to define it, to describe it, to talk about it, to work with it consciously, you drop out of it, and now you're describing something else. You're describing the shadow. You're describing the fallen aspect of it. And so that's the interplay between spirit and consciousness, and body consciousness and ego, and real time, or the real now moment, which is kind of just out of view of the body and the conscious mind and the perceptions of the sensory system. That is just outside, and we kind of use this hypersense to know, and that's kind of what I was saying, that it's not a thought, it's not a process you come to where you're, I'm finally in the moment, I made it. It's a knowing. You can't describe it, there's no words to describe it, it's purely knowing, it's pure awareness. And it's your awareness that comes to the now moment, and it's as if you come to see yourself, you meet yourself, because someone, that is you, arrives for the first time here and now, yet how do you know that? Well, it's you, your body consciousness, that sees it. And that's how the body, the ego, meets God, the divine aspect of you. Thank you.